Will Ukrainian long-range attacks on oil refineries be able to stop Putin? How result of operation in Pokrovsk can influence both sides? Where can nuclear tests of Russia and the USA lead? And what Angelina Jolie did in Kherson? All of these topics I am about to discuss with my guest from Washington, D.C., Charles Kupchan, international relations analyst. Charles, it's my pleasure to see you.
Good to be with you.
Yeah. We have been observing how Ukraine has increased number of long-range attacks on Russian oil refining industry. According to Ukrainian intelligence, our armed forces have destroyed approximately 20% of Russian industry. I don't have any shred of doubt that it is Russian pain point, but will be able this point become mortal one for Putin's ability to continue the war?
Well, I think you're right to call it a pain point because the attacks on infrastructure, oil infrastructure in particular, as well as arms depots, manufacturing sites, they increase the costs to Russia. They increase the pressure on Vladimir Putin. And very importantly, they bring home the war to average Russians, because the Russian government has done a pretty good job of insulating the country from the fact that it is fighting a major war. Life in many cities, St. Petersburg, Moscow, others, goes on as normal. But by disrupting the refinery system, you are depriving average Russians of gas. You're seeing prices go up. You're seeing long lines in gas stations. And as a consequence, the public is more aware of the fact that the country is in a major war. Will this be enough to convince Putin to stop? I think the answer is no. And that's in part because the income that Russia gets from oil sales, a lot of that is crude oil. It's not the refineries that Ukrainian drones are hitting. So the income to the federal government continues to flow in by selling oil to China and other parties. And I also think we've seen that Putin is ideologically committed to continue this war. He believes he can win. He believes not just that he can take more territory in eastern Ukraine, but perhaps break the government in Kyiv by pounding away. This war is likely to continue to burn on. I think Putin will stop only when he is stopped, and that will require the continued flow of military and economic assistance to Ukraine.
Yeah, we have also been observing difficult situation on front line in Pokrovsk. I realize that territorial gains by themselves is not Putin's main goal. His main goal is to deprive Ukraine of its sovereignty, and Pokrovsk is just a puzzle of complex war against Ukraine. But why does he put so much efforts to conquer this city? And how, whether positive or negative result of operation in Pokrovsk will influence us and Russia? Your opinion?
Well, I think that you're right to say that this is not a war about territory. I do think that Putin continues to believe that Ukraine does not deserve to exist as an independent sovereign state, that it belongs to Mother Russia. It should be pulled back into a Russian sphere of influence. And as a consequence, I don't think he would be satisfied just with the control of Donetsk and other parts of eastern Ukraine. I think he still aims to win this war. And winning means somehow pulling Ukraine back into the sphere of influence that Russia believes that it deserves. The battle that we see in Pokrovsk and other towns in the east, I think, is in some ways a proxy for Putin's belief that this is a war that really is of vital national interest to Russia. This is not just a war for this town or that town. This is a war against the West. This is a war to right the wrong of the post-Cold War settlement that has excluded Russia and denied Russia the great power, status, and influence that it deserves. And that's why I think Putin is prepared to expend enormous resources, many, many thousands of lives over a few square miles here, a few square miles there. Will this be a setback for Ukraine if Putin succeeds in taking Pokrovsk? Yes. Will this be a turning point in the war? No, I don't believe that's the case. And that's because Russia continues to expend enormous resources for little gain. This is a war that is highly painful for the Russians. And even if there is a breakthrough here or a breakthrough there, I don't really believe that Ukraine faces a Russia that is so capable that it can win the war, that it can break through Ukraine's defensive lines, that it can siege Kyiv and, in fact, take over the government. I think even Putin understands that trying to conquer Ukraine militarily is a bridge too far, right? He's been fighting now for 3+ years. We're hearing that somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million Russians have been killed or wounded as a result of a war. And so far, Russia has only about 20% of Ukrainian territory. I say only because 20% is obviously a big number, but that gives you some sense of how costly this has been. So will the fall of Pokrovsk be a setback for Ukraine, a win for Putin? Yes. Does this suddenly change the balance of power? Does it change fundamentally the battlefield? No.
As far as general perception of this war is concerned, how could you describe critical point in this conflict which is able to force Putin to stop?
You know, I think that Putin believes that time is on his side. He sees in the United States a government that is already questioning the continued flow of aid to Ukraine. He sees in Western Europe parties like Reform UK, National Rally, AfD in Germany. Already you have governments in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, in Hungary, that question the support that has been provided to Ukraine. So I think he thinks he can just wait out the West. He can wait out Ukraine. He can exhaust the Ukrainians. They're going to run out of manpower. Ukraine's going to run out of support because the West is going to tire of this. And so I think the task here is to convince Putin that that's not the case, that time is not on his side, that the EU, NATO, the United States are prepared to provide Ukraine what it needs to ensure that Putin will be stopped, and that part of Ukraine that is on the other side of the ceasefire line, wherever that ceasefire line ends up being, will move forward as a secure, independent, free democracy, able to make its own choices about its geopolitical alignments, able to choose to become a member of the European Union. And that, I think, is going to just require continued steadiness in the West. And I'm hoping, and I would go so far as to say I'm expecting that Trump might come around on this. He has already finally agreed to tighten sanctions against Russia. He may well ultimately decide to ask Congress for more money to send U.S. arms to Ukraine. I think that would be a very good sign, because it would give Ukraine the material and moral support that it needs, and it would set a very important message to Putin that the United States is not backing off, that the United States is prepared to stand with Ukraine and by Ukraine until the Kremlin decides it's had enough.
World-famous actress Angelina Jolie has visited Ukraine the second time during the full-scale invasion. Actually, I can't avoid this question because her visit has become information explosion in Ukraine. Do such visits remind the world about the war more efficiently than publications about clashes on frontline and Russian air terror, especially when there is war fatigue?
Those kinds of visits help, right? When you have somebody with Angelina Jolie's visibility, regular members of the public pay attention. And in some respects, the war in Ukraine is really about winning over the hearts and minds of electorates in Europe and the electorates in the United States. And so the more attention that the conflict gets, I think in many respects, the more you will see grassroots support for the continued flow of aid to Ukraine. And I think it's particularly true here in the United States, in Western Europe, right? In Poland, in Germany, in Finland. There is a palpable sense of existential threat that has stemmed from Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That sense of threat is much less tangible, much less present here in the United States, in part because we're thousands of miles away. And so when you have the visits of Hollywood stars, when you have the visits of prominent politicians, presidents, heads of state, when you have the visits of rock stars, it's a way of garnering attention. And I do think that here in the United States, there still is a lot of attention on Ukraine. If you pick up the daily papers, at least the big papers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, you will see on an almost daily basis a lot of coverage of the conflict in Ukraine. It's less true of media in the American heartland. And I think that's why it's particularly important to have the visits of people that have high popular visibility.
Yeah, actually, our people were very happy to see her. The next question is, Putin and Trump announced nuclear tests and rhetoric is getting tougher. Your forecast, to what consequences the situation can lead?
You know, I don't know how seriously we should take this sudden focus on renewing nuclear tests. Trump mentioned it during his trip. Is the United States suddenly going to start doing underground tests of nuclear weapons? We have had a situation where for quite a long time, we have not had tests. We've had a test ban treaty. And that's in part because you can do a lot of the testing that you need to do through simulations, through computer models, through experiments. And so that the need that we saw during the earlier nuclear age to test these weapons is not present. That having been said, there is a clear return to a nuclear arms race. China is building lots and lots of new nuclear weapons. On their current course, they may have a nuclear arsenal by the middle of the next decade that is about the same size as the arsenals of the United States and Russia. Russia has been talking about new kinds of nuclear powered delivery systems for potential delivery of a nuclear weapon. So there's a lot of movement here. And I do think that it's dangerous. I do think that we need to rekindle broad-based conversations about nuclear arms control, about limits on nuclear weapons. Those conversations need to include the Chinese. We need to talk about extending a agreement on bans on nuclear testing. That's going to be hard to come by as long as Ukraine is continuing to face aggression by Russia. Having a constructive relationship is very difficult while they are continuing to bomb and advance into a Ukrainian territory. So I do think that this is something that we need to keep an eye on, that part of the reason that we need to end the war in Ukraine to find a diplomatic resolution is to clear the way for constructive conversations about strategic stability and nuclear arms control.
Trump seems not to believe Putin anymore and starting using actions instead of words. The first step was sanctions against Russian oil sector. What can be the next? Because as we see, Trump's sanctions haven't changed Putin's mind towards the war. Will Trump provide us with long-range missiles as the next step? We have already talked about it, but I would like to hear more from you about the next steps, about the next potential steps.
I think that Trump's decision to increase sanctions against Russia is important because it does constitute a turning point. It's the first time where he has expressed not just anger with Putin and frustration with Putin, but taken a concrete step to increase the pressure on the Kremlin. And quite honestly, I think that Trump feels that Putin took advantage of him and that Putin did take advantage of Trump. He engaged in conversations on the phone where they had pleasant exchanges. They met face-to-face in Alaska, which was a big win for Putin because it let him out of the box of isolation at a face-to-face meeting with the American president. But there's no sign that Putin is negotiating in good faith, and Trump has realized that, and he's angry. He feels taken advantage of, and that's why I think he's ready to increase the sanctions. What's the next step? We don't know. Clearly, the United States is ready to provide Ukraine more weapons as long as they are being paid for by Europe. I do think one big issue that remains out there is when all of the money that Biden got, the $61 billion that he got approved last year when he was still president, when that runs out, and it will soon run out, is Trump going to ask Congress for more money? And in some ways, I'm less focused and less keen to see the transfer of Tomahawks or more long-range weapons than I am about giving Ukraine the kinds of weapons that it needs to shut down the Russian attack, to shut down the Russian advance. And that means more air defense, more help with strengthening the front line. Because even though I do believe that strikes on Russian territory can help, I do believe that sanctions against Russia can help. In the end of the day, I think that Vladimir Putin will stop when he realizes that he's just not going to get any further. And that's why I think the focus really has to be on providing the Ukrainian military what it needs to build an impregnable defensive line that makes a Russian advance, that makes further Russian aggression unfeasible and unproductive.
In my opinion, according to current geopolitical situation, this war will continue under the same circumstances and we will live in status quo next month. Frontline will be more or less stable, but with harsh battles. Air terror from Russia will continue. The United States and China will not take serious steps. Europe will continue to provide us with aid. Don't let us be defeated. Do you believe in keeping of this status quo, or you advocate of another scenario for the next month, for instance, half a year?
I think the status quo is likely to hold for now. I don't see any significant changes on the battlefield. I do think that Europe is edging toward a decision to use frozen Russian assets to provide assistance to Ukraine. I think that is a good decision because it would free up a lot of resources that Ukraine needs, and it needs now, given restraints on manpower, constraints on the budget, constraints on the front line and its ability to block further Russian advances. But I do think what key issue to continue to watch, and we were just discussing it, is what does Trump do? Does Trump realize and understand that if he wants to break the status quo. That if he wants to stop a war that just goes on and on and on with destruction on both sides, more Ukrainian lives lost, more of Ukraine destroyed, he's going to have to step up to the plate. He's going to have to say to Putin and convince Putin that he's not going to let Ukraine lose and that he's going to do what's necessary to stop Russia. One other piece of the puzzle that I think is important here, and that is China. China is Russia's main backer. China is buying lots of Russian oil. It's providing many of the materials that end up supporting the war effort. I do think that if you could get some kind of understanding or working relationship between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, one of the potential payoffs would be that Trump could convince Xi Jinping to put more pressure on Putin to stop. We're not there yet, but I do think that under the right circumstances, there is a potential to get China to play a more constructive role in helping to end this war.
Charles, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your answers, and have a good day.
Thank you. Good to chat with you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.